She wasn't on any roster. No rank, no call sign, no tactical designation. Her name didn't appear in the mission briefing. Nobody mentioned her in the pre-op intelligence report. She wasn't in any photograph pinned to any wall inside the operations center. She was just there, the way a chair is just there, the way a window is just there, background, furniture, invisible. They called her Maria. And when the other guys, the ones with the patches on their shoulders and the night vision rigs hanging off their helmets, talked about her at all, it was usually something like, "Hey, has anyone told Maria we're going to be out past midnight?" Or "Maria, any coffee left?" Or my personal favorite, the thing Sergeant Di Matteo used to say with that grin of his, "Don't worry about the perimeter, Maria's making a roast con lech, we're safe." Everybody laughed every single time. I laughed too. God help me, I laughed too. Let me back up, let me tell you where we were, because if you don't understand the place, you won't understand anything that happened next. It was 2011, late summer, the kind of heat that doesn't just sit on you, it presses you like a hand flat against your chest, slow and deliberate. We were operating out of a forward support base in a valley in eastern Afghanistan, a place that doesn't exist on any public map and never will. The mountains surrounding it were the color of dried bone. The wind came down through the passes in the early morning and it smelled like dust and diesel and something else, something older, something the land had been holding onto for centuries that I still can't name. The base itself was small, maybe 200 meters end to end at its widest point. There was a command post, barely more than reinforced plywood and sandbags, a vehicle bay, a medical tent that also served as the briefing room when we needed privacy, and a mess facility. Calling it a mess facility is generous. It was basically a modified shipping container with a portable propane unit, a prep table, and a shelf of dry goods that never had quite enough of anything. That was Maria's domain. Her full name was Maria Concepcion Villanueva Rios, and she was 43 years old, born in Oaxaca, Mexico. She'd come to the United States when she was 19, became a citizen at 31, spent 12 years cooking for a private defense contractor that supplied support personnel to forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. She wasn't military, she wasn't CIA, she wasn't special forces or intelligence or anything that comes with a title that makes people sit up straighter. She was a cook. That was the whole classification. Cook, GS equivalent, contractor status, civilian attached. She signed a stack of NDAs every time she renewed her contract, and then she went wherever they sent her and she cooked and she kept quiet and she listened. And God, did she listen. The first time I really noticed Maria, really noticed her, not just the way you notice a wall or a table, was maybe 6 weeks before everything happened. I'd come into the mess late, 2 in the morning, maybe 2:30. We'd just come back from a recon run that had gone longer than expected, and I was hungry in that hollow, almost angry way you get when your body has been running on adrenaline for 7 hours and suddenly the adrenaline stops and there's just nothing. She was still there, still awake. She had her head down over something on the prep table. I thought at first she was reading or maybe sleeping sitting up, but as I got closer I could see she was writing. Small, neat handwriting in a little notebook with a green cover. She heard me come in and she looked up and she didn't seem startled at all. "Hungry," she said. "Starving," I said. She closed the notebook, put it under the prep table on the shelf where she kept her personal things. She stood up and she started putting something together without asking what I wanted, and what she made me was a bowl of beans and rice with a fried egg on top and a thick slice of bread that she'd baked herself that morning, and it was the best thing I had eaten in 4 months. I sat at the end of the prep table and I ate, and she made herself a coffee and she sat down across from me, not right across, a little to the side, the way people sit when they're not trying to have a conversation but they're not trying to avoid one either, and for a while neither of us said anything. Then she said, "You were north tonight." It wasn't a question. I looked at her. "Why do you say that?" She shrugged one shoulder. "The dust on your boots is lighter, more limestone, the South Valley has more clay." She took a sip of her coffee. "Also, you came back missing Rodriguez, he only goes north." I didn't say anything for a moment. "You pay attention," I finally said. She looked at me with those dark, level eyes of hers and she said, "I always pay attention." And then she picked up her coffee again and looked at the wall, and that was the end of that conversation. I thought about it for a long time after. Her routine was the same every day. Up at 4 in the morning, she'd have coffee made by 4:15. Breakfast service started at 5:30 for early rotation, 6:30 for main rotation. She'd clean and prep for the rest of the morning, then lunch at 12, then an hour or two of what she called descanso, her rest, and then back at it for dinner at 6. She worked 7 days a week. She never complained. She never asked for days off. What she did do in those quiet hours between prep and service was walk. Not jog, not exercise, just walk. Around the perimeter of the base, slow and steady, her hands behind her back, her head slightly down like she was thinking hard about something. She did this every day, sometimes twice a day. The guards on the perimeter knew her and they'd nod and she'd nod back and she'd keep walking. I asked her once what she was thinking about on those walks. Everything, she said. Like what? She thought for a moment. The vehicles, she said. Which ones move, which ones don't, which ones move at the same time every day and which ones move at different times. She paused. The people who eats a lot before a mission, who can't eat at all, who comes back and eats 3 plates and who comes back and doesn't eat anything for 2 days. She looked at me sideways. Food tells you things, people don't think it does, but it does. I laughed. I remember that, I laughed. The guys liked her, most of them did anyway. She was warm but not familiar, there's a difference, and she understood it instinctively. She knew when to leave a man alone and when to put an extra portion on his plate without being asked. She remembered what everyone's preferences were without writing them down. Di Matteo didn't like onions, she always left them out of his food. Kowalski was lactose intolerant, but he always tried to eat the pudding anyway, and she'd started making a version just for him with coconut milk that he claimed tasted better than the original. Captain Hartwell took his coffee black, no sugar, but only from the second pot. He said the first pot always tasted metallic from the heat element, and he was right, and Maria always told him when the second pot was ready. She paid attention to all of it, every person, every preference, every small human detail. Nobody paid much attention back. The mission, the one that changed everything, had been in planning for about 3 weeks when I first heard about it. I wasn't read in on the full details until about 10 days before the planned execution date. What I can tell you is this: there was a compound roughly 40 kilometers northeast of our base, tucked into a canyon system that ran along a secondary ridgeline. Intelligence, some of the most solid intelligence we'd received in that whole deployment, indicated that the compound was being used as a staging area and communications hub by a network that had been responsible for at least 6 major attacks on coalition positions in the previous 18 months. The mission was a direct action raid. Go in, neutralize the threat, collect materials, extract. 2 helicopters, 1 ground element, close air support on standby. The ground element was a 12-man SEAL team that had been operating in the region for 2 months and knew the terrain. Simple, clean, the kind of thing these guys had done dozens of times. Except 3 days before the mission, something changed. I don't know the full story even now. What I know is that the intelligence picture shifted. Significantly, what had looked like a communications hub turned out to be something bigger, much bigger. The compound wasn't just a staging area. It was a coordination point for a much larger operation, and the number of personnel present wasn't the estimated 12 to 15, the revised estimate. Based on new signals intelligence and a drone pass that came back with thermal readings none of us liked, was somewhere between 350 and 420 armed fighters. 12 SEALs, 400 fighters. The mission parameters didn't change. That's the part that kept me up at night then and keeps me up at night now. The mission parameters didn't change because the window didn't change. There was a 72-hour period during which the target personnel were all going to be in one place, and if the mission didn't happen inside that window, the intelligence would be obsolete and the opportunity would be gone for months, maybe longer. So the plan adapted: more support assets, a second ground element, revised extraction, a contingency package that was frankly the most complicated thing I'd seen assembled in that theater. And on the night before the mission briefing, I walked into the mess at 8 o'clock for dinner, and Maria was standing at the prep table with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, looking at nothing, with that expression she got sometimes, focused but far away, like she was watching something happening behind her eyes. She looked at me when I came in and she said, without any preamble, "Tomorrow's brief is going to be long." I stopped. "What makes you say that?" She nodded toward the corner of the room where a stack of 12 laminated briefing folders had been delivered earlier that afternoon, waiting to be distributed. "Counted the folders," she said, "and Captain Hartwell ate dinner at 4:15. He only eats early like that when he's going to be up all night." I looked at her for a long moment. "Maria," I said carefully, "what else have you noticed?" She looked at me steadily. And for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't answer right away. That alone told me something, because Maria Villanueva-Rios was not a woman who chose her silences carelessly. When she went quiet, she meant to go quiet. And in that moment, standing in the yellow light of the mess container with the sound of the generator humming outside and the mountains dark beyond the wire, she went quiet in a way that made the air in the room feel different, heavier, like before a storm. Then she walked over to the corner where her shelf was, the little personal space under the prep table, the one place in the whole base that was genuinely hers, and she pulled out the green notebook. The one I'd seen her writing in that night weeks ago. She held it in both hands for a second, not opening it, just holding it, like she was deciding something. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She put the notebook on the table between us, but she didn't open it yet. She made coffee, not because either of us needed it, I think, but because she needed to do something with her hands. She poured 2 cups and she sat down across from me, and this time she sat directly across from me, not to the side. This time she was trying to have a conversation. "I need you to tell me something first," she said, "and I need you to be honest." "Okay," I said. "Do they know there's a problem with the Northeast approach route?" Everything in me went still. The Northeast approach route. The approach route that exactly 0 people outside of a classified planning session of maybe 8 people had ever discussed in my presence. "How do you know about the Northeast approach?" I said. My voice came out very careful. She looked at me with those steady eyes. "I don't know the specifics," she said. "I know there's a problem, I can tell from the conversations." "What conversations?" "The planning sessions are in the medical tent. The door is closed." "Yes," she said, "but people come out of those sessions. They come here and they eat, or they come here and they don't eat, which tells me more. And they talk to each other in here at the table, and sometimes they forget that the woman washing dishes in the corner can hear them perfectly well." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I have been doing this for 12 years in 5 different countries. I have heard more operational conversations in mess facilities than most of your analysts have read in their whole careers. Not because I was trying to, because people forget I'm there." She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. A factual description of a thing that was true and had always been true and would probably always be true. She said it the way you'd describe the weather. I stared at her. "The Northeast approach," I said. "What do you think you know?" She opened the notebook. What was inside that notebook was not the kind of thing I expected. I don't know what I expected exactly. Notes about inventory maybe, food orders, shopping lists, the kind of things a cook would write in a notebook. But what Maria had written in there in her small, neat, unhurried handwriting was something else entirely. Observations. 12 years of them, not just from this deployment. From all of them, Iraq, Kuwait, the Horn of Africa, 2 other Afghan deployments I didn't know she'd been on. She'd been watching and listening and writing it all down for 12 years, and nobody had ever thought to look. She flipped to a section near the back. Recent entries, dated from the past 3 weeks. I started reading and I made it about 4 entries in before I had to stop and look up at her. "You watched the drone footage," I said. "I didn't watch the drone footage," she said. "But I heard Lieutenant Price and Sergeant Okafor talking about it at breakfast 4 days ago. Lieutenant Price said the canyon had more foot traffic than expected coming from the western side. Okafor said that was consistent with what the HUMINT was showing, but that the northeast corridor was still the cleanest approach. And Price said," she looked down at the notebook and read quietly, "only if they haven't been running the ridge path." And then they both stopped talking when Di Matteo came in. She looked up. "So I started thinking about the ridge path," she said. "And about 3 days ago Abdullah came in." Abdullah was our local national interpreter. He was 26, smart, loyal as a stone wall, had been working with coalition forces for 4 years. "He asked me if I had any naan left from lunch," Maria continued. "I did, and I gave him some, and he sat down and ate it, and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he said," she checked the notebook again, "My cousin lives in the next valley. He says the shepherd trails on the North Ridge have been busy for 3 weeks. He said it like he was making conversation. But he looked at me when he said it. Abdullah never looks at me when he talks. He looks at his food or the wall." She paused. "He wanted someone to hear it, he just didn't know who to tell it to." I felt something cold moving up the back of my neck. "What does that mean?" I said, busy how. "It means," she said carefully, "that there might be people on that ridge who aren't supposed to be there. And if the northeast approach takes your men along that ridge." She didn't finish, she didn't have to. "I want to tell you that I immediately ran to the command post and threw this information on Captain Hartwell's desk, and everything got fixed right then and there. That would be the clean version, the satisfying version. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I sat there for a moment trying to figure out how to explain to my commanding officer that the cook had essentially reconstructed part of our classified mission plan through 12 years of listening to soldiers eat breakfast. And that she had maybe, possibly, identified a critical intelligence gap through a conversation with our interpreter over leftover flatbread. It sounds insane. Even sitting here now, years later, it still sounds insane. But I'd read those notebook pages and I'd looked at Maria's face, and the thing about Maria was that she was never dramatic. She never inflated anything. When she said she thought there might be a problem, she'd already stress-tested the idea from 6 different angles before she let herself say it out loud. "How certain are you?" I asked. "I'm not certain of anything," she said. "I'm a cook. I don't have access to the satellite data or the SIGINT or whatever else you people look at. All I have is what I've heard and what I've seen and 12 years of knowing when something feels wrong." She met my eyes. "This feels wrong." "What specifically feels wrong?" She was quiet for a second, then, 3 things. First, the ridge path and Abdullah's cousin. Second, Captain Hartwell has been sleeping badly for 4 nights. I can tell because he's been coming for coffee an hour earlier than normal, and he takes it with sugar now. He never takes sugar. He takes sugar when he's exhausted and needs the quick hit. Something is worrying him that he's not saying out loud. She held up a 3rd finger. And third, Kowalski hasn't eaten anything real in 36 hours. He'll pick up a plate and then he'll set it down and walk away. He does that when his gut is telling him something his brain hasn't processed yet. He trusts his gut better than anyone on this base, and his gut is screaming. I opened my mouth. I closed it again. Because she was right about Kowalski. I'd noticed it myself. I'd chalked it up to pre-mission nerves, which all of us got. But Maria had corroborated it against 2 other independent signals, and she'd sat down and thought about it, and she was telling me the picture those 3 things together were painting. I pushed my chair back. "Don't go anywhere," I said. Getting Captain Hartwell to come to the mess at 9 o'clock at night was not the easiest conversation I've ever had. "This better be important," he said when he came through the door. "Sir," I said, "just please hear her out." He looked at Maria. Maria was standing at the prep table with the green notebook open in front of her, and she was calm. Completely, unnervingly calm. The way you're calm when you've already done the hard part and now you're just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Hartwell pulled out a chair and sat down like a man who expected to be annoyed for the next 10 minutes. He was not annoyed for 10 minutes. He sat very still while Maria talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss. He asked 4 questions, each one precise, each one cutting to the exact right thing, and each time Maria answered him directly and without hedging. When she got to Abdullah's comment about the shepherd trails, Hartwell's jaw did something, a small tightening, almost invisible. When she finished, he sat there for a moment. "How long have you been keeping this notebook?" he said. 12 years, Maria said. "You've never reported any of this before." "I reported things to my contractor supervisor twice," she said evenly. "Both times I was told that my observations were outside my contracted scope of work and that I should focus on food service operations." A brief pause, so I kept writing it down. Something moved across Hartwell's face that I couldn't fully read. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something that looked more like the specific pain of realizing a mistake had been made and that the mistake had not been made by the person sitting across from him. He stood up, he looked at me. "Get Okafor and Price, operations tent now." He was 3 steps toward the door when he stopped and turned back. "Mrs. Villanueva Rios," he said. Maria looked at him. "Don't leave the base," he said. "I may need you available in the next 6 hours." What followed was one of the longest nights of my deployment. Hartwell pulled the northeast approach plan apart and put it back together in the light of what Maria had told him. He got Abdullah in at 11 o'clock and sat with him for an hour, not interrogating, just talking carefully the way Hartwell did things, and Abdullah confirmed everything. His cousin's information, the unusual traffic on the ridge trails. He'd been trying to find the right moment to raise it with someone who would listen. He hadn't found one. Until Maria. By 2 in the morning, the northeast approach had been revised. The ridge path was taken out of the route entirely. A new primary approach was established through a lower canyon passage that added 40 minutes to the ingress time but kept the element away from the ridge completely. Close air support tasking was adjusted to cover the ridge as a contingency watch area. At 2:45, Captain Hartwell came back to the mess. Maria was still there. She'd cleaned up from dinner service and she was working through prep for the next day's breakfast, moving around her little domain with the same unhurried, deliberate efficiency she always had. She didn't look up when he came in. "Coffee's on," she said. He poured a cup. He stood at the counter for a moment. Then he said, "We changed the approach." "Good," she said. She was chopping something. She didn't stop. based primarily on your information. Based on Abdullah's information, she said, I just connected some dots. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. The ridge approach would have put our men directly into an L-shaped ambush position that we didn't know was there. He paused. We know now because of you. Maria set down her knife. She turned around and she looked at him with those steady dark eyes and she said simply, then make sure they come home. Hartwell looked at her for a long second. Yes, ma'am, he said. The mission executed 2 days later. I wasn't on it. My role was back at the base, part of the coordination and communications element, so I wasn't there for what happened in that canyon. I have the reports, I have the debriefs. I have what the team members told me afterward in pieces over the weeks and months that followed. But what I know is this. At the moment when the ground element was moving through the lower canyon passage, the new passage, the one that hadn't been in the original plan 48 hours before, 2 of the guys in the element looked up at the ridge line above the old northeast approach route. And they could see figures up there in the green wash of their night vision. Waiting. There's a word for it in operational language. We call it a compromised position. It means a location specifically chosen to observe and engage a movement corridor, not from the front, not from behind, but from the side and above, where the geometry of fire gives the shooter maximum coverage and minimum exposure. An L-shaped ambush is the textbook version. You catch the target element in the middle of the channel, light them up from 2 directions, and the physics of the situation do the rest. The northeast ridge above the original approach route was a compromised position. It had been set up, we learned later, from materials recovered at the compound, at least 9 days before the mission. 9 days. They had known a raid was coming. Not the exact date, not the exact team, but they'd known the general shape of it, and they'd placed shooters on that ridge with a specific directive. Wait for the element to come through the canyon below, let the first third of the column pass the trigger point, then initiate. The element had 12 men. 12 men in a canyon with steep walls on both sides, with fighters above and fighters at the far end. At the compound itself, which the drone thermal readings had revised upward to 411 armed personnel on the night of the mission. 12 men. Maria's notebook had 2.5 pages dedicated to what she'd pieced together about that ridge, mostly from fragments of conversation and Abdullah's information, and 3 weeks of watching who came back from recon runs with that specific expression, the one where something didn't add up and they hadn't figured out what yet. 2.5 pages in a green notebook under a prep table in a shipping container mess facility in a valley that doesn't exist on any public map. Those 2.5 pages are the reason 12 men came home. I want to tell you what the night felt like from the base, because I think people forget that there are always people left behind on a mission night, people who stay at the radios and the screens and wait, and the waiting is its own specific kind of awful. The operations tent was full, standing room only, which never happens. Nobody wanted to be anywhere else. The air was close and warm despite the cool night outside because there were too many bodies and too much tension in too small a space. The radio traffic was disciplined, short transmissions, code words, the clipped professional language that strips out everything human so that communication is purely functional. You listen for the patterns, you listen for the pauses, you listen for the tone. I wasn't in the operations tent. I was in the mess. I know how that sounds. But there was nothing I could do in the operations tent that wasn't already being done by people whose actual job it was, and the operations tent was so full that my being there was just adding heat to the room. And Maria was in the mess. She wasn't pretending nothing was happening. She wasn't just going about her routine and ignoring the weight of it. She was sitting at the end of the prep table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she had her green notebook open in front of her and she was reading back through it, old entries, old deployments. The slow accumulated record of 12 years of paying attention. I came in at 23:10 and I said, nothing yet. She nodded. I sat down, neither of us said anything for a while. Do you do this every mission night? I finally asked. Sit here and wait. Every single one. She said. For how long? She thought about it. The first time was in Iraq. 2005, a team went out from a FOB I was supporting and I sat in the kitchen all night, and in the morning some of them didn't come back. She paused. I didn't know any of them well. I knew what they ate for breakfast. I knew who took sugar and who didn't. I knew which ones saved bread for later and which ones ate everything on their plate immediately. She looked at the open notebook. And when some of them didn't come back, all of that knowing felt, she searched for the word, unbearable, to know those small things about someone and then have them be gone. She closed the notebook. So I started writing it down, she said. All of it, everything I noticed, because if I was going to carry all of this knowing around with me, it was going to mean something. I was going to make it mean something. She looked at me. I didn't know how. For a long time I didn't know how. I just kept writing. At 47, the radio traffic in the operations tent changed. I know because the sound of it carried. Not words, the walls were too thick for words, but the rhythm of it changed. The packing. There's a difference between routine check-in traffic and reactive traffic, between the tempo of a mission running on schedule and the tempo of a mission that has encountered something. It's not louder exactly, it's more compressed, tighter, like everyone is speaking faster while simultaneously being very careful about what they're saying. I stood up. Maria looked at me. Go, she said. I went. What had happened, and I'm going to tell you the compressed version because the full version involves a lot of technical detail that will get in the way of what actually matters, is this. The element had made the ingress through the lower canyon passage without incident. They were within 600 meters of the target compound, moving through a secondary approach corridor when the point man stopped. He'd heard something. Not much, a dislodged stone maybe, or the sound of cloth against rock. The kind of thing that only a man whose whole nervous system has been trained to hear the wrong note in the right symphony would catch. But he stopped, and the element stacked up behind him and they went still. On the ridge above the original approach route, the one they were no longer using, something moved. Multiple somethings? The night vision operator tracking the ridgeline called it at 4 to 6 silhouettes moving into position, and they were above the canyon channel that the element was now not in. The channel was empty. The ridge was watching an empty canyon. The element had 3 minutes, maybe 4, before the ridge position recognized that something had changed. Before the timing of the expected movement through the lower corridor fell apart, before they started looking for where the element actually was. The SEAL team commander, a man I'll call Daniels because that's not his name, made a decision in approximately 10 seconds. He split the element. 6 men pushed hard toward the target compound, fast, noise discipline abandoned, speed now the priority, while the remaining 6 set up a covering position. What happened next is classified at a level I genuinely cannot get into without consequences. What I can tell you is that the mission objectives were achieved. The compound was hit. The materials were recovered. The element extracted with no fatalities. But here is the thing that I need you to understand. The thing that Daniels told me himself 3 weeks later, sitting in that mess over the food that Maria had made. He said, if we'd come through the northeast corridor, we'd have walked directly under that ridge with no warning and nowhere to go. 400 fighters in front of us, 8 to 10 shooters above and behind us, walls on both sides. The math on that doesn't work. The math on that is everyone dead or captured, and I mean everyone, and then it becomes a hostage situation and an international incident, and nothing about that ends cleanly. He picked up his fork, put it down again. We had one path. And we were on the wrong one, and someone figured it out. He looked across the mess toward Maria, who was at the prep table with her back to us. Her, he said quietly. Her, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Has she always been here, he said. Since before the deployment started, I said. He nodded slowly. I don't think I've ever talked to her, he said. No, I said, most people haven't. The aftermath was complicated in ways that take a long time to fully unpack. There were questions, naturally. There were people up the chain who wanted to understand how a contractor cook had come to possess a notebook full of operational observations that technically represented intelligence product gathered outside of any sanctioned collection framework. There were lawyers, actual lawyers, JAG and civilian both, who got involved for about 2 weeks and then quietly went away, which usually means something was resolved in a direction nobody wanted to put in writing. Maria was interviewed multiple times by multiple people representing multiple parts of the enterprise. She answered every question calmly and completely. She showed them the notebook, all of it, 12 years, 5 countries. She'd never shared any of it, never tried to monetize it, never handed it to anyone. She just kept writing it down because she'd needed to make the knowing mean something. After the second interview, her contractor supervisor, a different one from the 2 who dismissed her before. Those men no longer worked for the company, called her to tell her that the company was opening a formal review of her observations and might want to create a new role that would allow her to continue this work in a more official capacity. Maria thanked him politely and told him she'd think about it. Then she went back to the mess and started prep for dinner. I visited her a week later. Unofficial visit, just went in for coffee like I always did. Have you decided, I asked. About the new roles? Yeah. She poured coffee for both of us and she stood on the other side of the prep table for a moment. They want to put me in an office, she said. With analysts, with reports to write and methodologies to document and meetings to attend. She didn't say it with contempt exactly, more like she was examining the idea from all sides the way she examined everything. They want to take what I do and put it in a structure. Would that be so bad? I said. Maybe not, she said. Maybe that's the right thing. Maybe there's a version of what I do that can be taught, that other people can learn, that makes more difference because it's organized and official. She wrapped her hands around her mug. But the thing that makes it work, the reason people talk around me, the reason Abdullah said what he said about the shepherd trails is because I'm nobody. I'm the cook, I'm the furniture. She looked at me steadily. The moment I become something official, I stop being nobody. And then I stop hearing things. I thought about that for a while. So what will you do? I asked. Same thing I've always done, she said. And she picked up her coffee and looked at the wall, and that was the end of that conversation. There's a photograph. I've seen it exactly once, about 8 months after the deployment ended. A friend of mine, someone who worked in a different part of the building, the kind of building that doesn't have a name on the front, showed it to me on a tablet and then put the tablet away and never mentioned it again. He showed it to me, I think, because he knew I'd been there, because he knew I understood what it represented. The photograph was taken inside the operations center during the debrief of the mission. It's a room full of people, analysts, planners, the team members themselves, and there are maps on the walls and papers on the table, and the whole scene has that particular washed-out, fluorescent-like quality that every military briefing room in every country seems to have. Everyone in it is looking at the same thing. A hand-drawn diagram on a whiteboard that shows the original northeast approach route and the revised lower canyon route side by side with the ridge position marked on it in red. Everyone is looking at the whiteboard. Everyone except one person in the far left corner of the frame, barely visible, slightly out of focus, because the camera's depth of field was set for the whiteboard. Maria, standing there with a tray of coffee cups, looking not at the whiteboard but at the people looking at the whiteboard, watching their faces the way she watched everything, quiet, still, already writing it down in her head. The caption on the photograph, in the metadata that my friend let me glimpse for about 3 seconds, was just a case number and a date. No name. No name. I've thought about that a lot. The no name. It bothered me for a long time in a way I couldn't fully articulate, and I've gone back and forth on it enough that I think I finally understand what I was feeling. On one level, it's practical. You don't put a civilian contractor's name on classified photographs. That's not a judgment, it's a procedure. She wouldn't have wanted to be identified in that kind of material anyway. I think Maria would have found the idea uncomfortable, not from modesty, but from that instinct she had about the value of invisibility. Every name attached to her was a door that closed. But on another level, the level where things mean things beyond their function, it represents something that was true for 12 years and will probably always be true for people like Maria. The ones who do the work that can't be officially categorized, who see the things that the official observers are positioned not to see, because the official observers are known, and being known means people perform differently around you. The ones who carry the weight of all that seeing and all that knowing and do it without any framework to set it in, just a green notebook under a prep table. No name. No name in the system, no name in the report, no name in the photograph. But the men came home. About 6 months after I rotated back stateside, I was at a conference in Virginia, one of those events where people from different parts of the enterprise sit in the same room and talk around the things they can't actually say out loud directly. Lots of careful language, lots of concepts described in abstractions. There was a panel on non-traditional information collection environments, and I sat in the back and listened to 4 people with impressive institutional affiliations discuss, in careful theoretical terms, the untapped intelligence value of support and logistics personnel in forward operating positions. They talked about it like it was a new idea. Like someone had just thought of it. I didn't say anything. I sat in the back and I thought about a green notebook and a woman making coffee at 4 in the morning in a valley that doesn't exist on any public map. And I thought about Abdullah and the shepherd trails, and I thought about Kowalski not eating for 36 hours and what that meant to someone who knew how to read it. After the panel, during the coffee break, I walked up to one of the speakers, a senior analyst type, well-dressed, clearly very smart, and I told her that I'd served alongside someone who had been doing exactly what the panel was describing without institutional support for over a decade. She looked interested. What did they do officially? She asked. Cook, I said. She waited for me to say more. That was it, I said. That was the whole thing. She was a cook. The analyst looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Do you think she'd be willing to talk to us?" And I said honestly, "I have no idea where she is." That was the truth. After the deployment ended, Maria's contract was renewed for another rotation at a different FOB in a different region. I had no contact information for her, she didn't use social media, didn't have an email address that I knew of, existed in no civilian database that I could access without going through channels that would raise questions I didn't feel like answering. I thought about her from time to time, more than from time to time, honestly. I thought about her the way you think about something that changed the shape of how you understand a thing, not constantly, but whenever the relevant category came up, whenever something reminded me. I thought about her when I read about a hostage situation in the Middle East that was resolved through what the after-action described as timely intelligence from an unconventional source. I thought about her when my niece, who was studying political science, told me that all the important information in history came from surveillance and technology, and I didn't contradict her, just nodded and thought about a green notebook. I thought about her every single time I walked into a restaurant for about 2 years and found myself briefly scanning the kitchen to see who was paying attention. Old habit now, can't shake it. I found out 3 years after the deployment through a connection who knew a connection who had been on a rotation in West Africa that Maria had been on that rotation too. Same story, forward support base mess facility contractor cook, same green notebook presumably, same walks around the perimeter, same way of sitting at the corner of a room and being nobody. The same connection told me that at some point during that rotation, Maria had flagged something to the base commander, something she'd picked up from a conversation, something that cross-referenced with a pattern she'd seen 3 years before in a completely different theater, and that the flag had resulted in a change of route for a convoy that had been scheduled for the following day. The original route had been that morning, 3 hours before the convoy would have passed through. The convoy went a different way, everyone came home. My connection didn't know the details, couldn't tell me the specific conversation, the specific flag, the specific decision chain, just, she noticed something, she said something, people listened this time, the convoy went a different way. I've been trying to write this down for a long time. Years, actually. I've started it 4 or 5 times and each time I've gotten a certain distance in and then stopped because I hit the same problem every time. The problem is that the story doesn't have the shape that stories are supposed to have. There's no moment where Maria gets the recognition she deserves. There's no ceremony, no medal, no official acknowledgement, no newspaper story, no promotion. The green notebook didn't end up in a museum or a training program or a declassified archive. As far as I know, it's still with her wherever she is, still being added to, still being used, still quietly doing the thing that official frameworks couldn't contain. The problem is also that the story doesn't end. Maria is still out there, somewhere. Some base, some forward position, some mess facility with a propane unit and a prep table and a shelf where she keeps her personal things, making coffee at 4 in the morning, walking the perimeter with her hands behind her back, looking at everything, missing nothing, being nobody in a room full of somebodies. And the somebodies are talking to each other, around her, past her, over her head, forgetting she's there. And she's writing it all down. Daniels, the team commander, the one who told me about the geometry of the Northeast Corridor, ran into me at an event about 2 years after the deployment. We hadn't seen each other since the debrief. We had a drink and talked about nothing particular for a while, and then toward the end of the night, out of nowhere, he said, "I still think about her." I knew exactly who he meant. "Yeah," I said, "me too." "Does she know?" he said. "Like, does she actually know what she did? Does she understand the—" He paused, searching for the word, the scale of it. "I think she understands it better than we do," I said. He thought about that. "Why do you say that?" "Because she's the one who had to figure out what to do with knowing things that nobody else was positioned to know," I said. "For 12 years, without any validation, without any institutional support, without even the comfort of being able to tell most people what she was doing, she had to make her own meaning for it." I turned my glass in my hands. She already went through the hard version of that question. She came out the other side. The notebook is what came out the other side. Daniels nodded slowly. "A green notebook," he said. "A green notebook," I said. He shook his head. "No call sign, no rank, no none of the stuff we build around each other to make the work feel real, to make ourselves feel like we matter." "She didn't need it to feel like she mattered," I said. "She already knew she mattered, she just needed the work to matter too." Daniels was quiet for a long time, then he raised his glass. "To the cook," he said. I raised mine. To Maria, I said, there's a question I've been asked the few times I've talked about this to anyone who was cleared to hear it. The question is, why didn't anyone notice earlier? And I've given different versions of the answer at different times, depending on what I thought the person asking could hear. Sometimes I've said it was a failure of institutional attention, which is true. Sometimes I've said it was a function of the way support personnel are categorized and therefore perceived, which is also true. Sometimes I've talked about the structural blindness that comes with rank and role, the way the machinery of military operations sorts people into functions and then stops seeing past the function to the person. All of that is true. But the truest answer, the one I usually don't say because it requires a particular kind of honesty about human nature that most people find uncomfortable, is simpler. Nobody noticed because Maria was a middle-aged woman doing a domestic task in a combat environment. That's it. That's the whole thing. I don't say this to make a particular kind of argument. I say it because it's accurate, and because accuracy matters when you're trying to understand how things happen and why they don't get caught until they almost become catastrophes. The specific combination of those factors, female, older, domestic work, support role, creates an invisibility that is not accidental and not neutral. It is a product of accumulated assumptions, each one small and seemingly reasonable on its own, that stack up into something that has real operational consequences. She was a cook. You don't debrief the cook. You don't ask the cook what she's noticed. You don't look at the cook when you're trying to build an intelligence picture. You look at the people whose job it is to build intelligence pictures and you accept the picture they give you, and you don't interrogate the gap between what the picture shows and what the woman washing dishes in the corner has been quietly watching for 12 years. Maria understood this better than anyone. It's why she didn't try to change it. The invisibility was the instrument. The moment you remove the invisibility, the instrument stops working. But understanding why something works doesn't mean the thing that makes it work is fair or acceptable or something we should be comfortable perpetuating. I've sat with that tension for a long time. The last time I saw Maria was about 8 months before I started writing this down. I was back in Afghanistan on a different deployment, different role, different base. I was passing through a transit hub on my way to a meeting that I can't describe, and I had about 4 hours to kill at this hub, which was a larger facility than the one I'd been at before, more permanent infrastructure, a real mess hall, actual tables and chairs, instead of a folding table in a shipping container. I walked into the mess hall for lunch and I was 3 steps inside before I registered her. She was at the far end of the serving line, same posture, same deliberate, unhurried way of moving. Her hair was more gray than I remembered, almost fully gray now, pulled back the same way it always was. She was ladling soup into a bowl for a young soldier who couldn't have been 22, and she was listening to something he was saying, that particular attentive stillness of hers that wasn't quite eye contact and wasn't quite not eye contact, the way she listened that made you feel like she was receiving you at a frequency most people didn't have. I stood there for a second. She looked up. For a moment neither of us said anything. Then she smiled, a small, private smile, the kind that doesn't need to be big to be real, and she ladled another portion of soup and held the bowl out toward me and said, "You look hungry." I laughed. I couldn't help it. I took the bowl, I went through the line. I found a table and I sat down, and a few minutes later, during a lull in the service rush, she came and sat across from me with a cup of tea. Not coffee this time, tea. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "This post for months." "You like it?" "It's fine," she said, which for Maria meant yes. We talked for a while. Easy conversation, the kind you have with someone when you've already been through something together and you don't need to keep establishing context. She asked about some of the people from the old deployment, Kowalski, who had left the service and gone back to his family's farm in Wisconsin. Di Matteo, who was on his 3rd deployment and apparently still making jokes about her cooking. Abdullah, who had been resettled through a special immigrant visa program and was living in Virginia and working as a translator for a private firm. "Good," she said when I told her about Abdullah, quiet and certain, "good." I asked her about the new posting, about what she'd seen so far, what she'd noticed. She gave me a look that was partly amused and partly something more serious. "You know I can't tell you that," she said. "Can't or won't?" "Both," she said and smiled the small smile again. I asked her something I'd been carrying around for years without finding the right moment to say. "Do you think about the ones who didn't come home?" I said. From the times before anyone listened, before you figured out how to make the knowing mean something, the ones from the early deployments. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her tea. She turned the cup slowly in her hands. Outside the mess hall, the sound of a helicopter coming in on approach, the distant rhythmic chop of rotor blades that becomes, over time, as familiar and unremarkable as the sound of traffic. "Yes," she said. "Just that." "I think about them," she said. "I think about what I saw and didn't know how to use yet, what I heard and didn't know how to translate into something actionable. I think about whether, if I'd understood earlier what I was building, if someone had helped me understand it, if the structure had existed to receive it." She paused. "Maybe different, maybe not, I don't know." "Does it still hurt?" I asked. The question felt too personal the moment I said it, but Maria didn't flinch. "Of course it does," she said. "If it stopped hurting, I'd stop paying attention. The hurt is part of the mechanism." She looked up at me. "The day you stop feeling it is the day you start missing things." I've tried to figure out what category Maria belongs to, not for official purposes, that ship has sailed, but for my own understanding of what I saw and what it means. She's not a spy. She wasn't running agents, she wasn't running operations, she wasn't doing anything that would fit any conventional definition of intelligence work. She was observing, correlating, building a picture from fragments that nobody else was positioned to collect because nobody else had the combination of access, patience, and invisibility that she had. She's not a soldier, she never carried a weapon, she never operated in a direct action capacity, she wouldn't have wanted to. She's not an analyst, technically, no degree in that field, no institutional training, no methodology that anyone wrote down and approved. She's something that doesn't have a name in the bureaucracy, which is maybe appropriate. The bureaucracy, after all, is the thing that kept not seeing her until the moment it suddenly couldn't afford not to. What she is, I think, the best word I have for it, is a witness. A witness to everything that happens in the spaces between the official events. The spaces between the briefings and the operations and the after-action reports and the career building and the hierarchy maintaining. The spaces where people eat and talk and don't talk and keep their own counsel and let small things slip when they forget someone is listening. She was the keeper of the spaces between. And the spaces between, it turns out, are where the truth lives. When I got up to leave, I thanked her for the soup. She waved a hand, not dismissively, more like accepting the thanks without letting it be a larger thing than it needed to be. I was almost to the door when she said my name. I turned back. She was already at the serving line again, back to the work, but she'd turned her head slightly and she said, without fully looking at me, "Tell Daniels thank you." "For what?" I said. "He knows," she said, and she turned back to the serving line. I didn't know what she meant then. I figured it out about a year later when I had lunch with Daniels and he mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been working with his chain of command for 2 years on something, a program, a proposal, a framework of some kind designed to formalize the role of support personnel as a potential intelligence-adjacent resource, not to turn cooks into spies, not to change the function, just to create a channel. A way for information like Maria's information to flow upward without the person providing it having to find the exactly right officer at exactly the right moment who happened to be willing to listen at 4 in the morning over a cup of coffee. He'd named the framework in the proposal. Not officially, it would never be official, the system doesn't work that way. But in the internal documentation, in the working title that the people involved used among themselves, he'd called it something. He told me what it was called. He called it the Green Notebook Initiative. She'll never see a medal for it. There won't be a ceremony. Her name will not appear in any official record in a way that can be found without clearances that most people will never have. In 20 years, if anyone asks what happened on the night of that mission, what changed the approach, what sent 12 men through the lower canyon instead of into the ambush on the ridge, the official answer will be revised intelligence assessment, and that will be technically accurate and almost entirely incomplete. Somewhere there's a woman making coffee at 4 in the morning in a place that doesn't have a name. She's got a green notebook, probably a new one by now, the old one's full and stored somewhere safe. She's walking the perimeter in the early light, hands behind her back, watching the vehicles that move and the vehicles that don't, watching who eats before a mission and who can't eat at all. Listening to the conversations that happen around her, through her, past her, in the permanent, comfortable assumption that the woman doing the domestic work isn't the one you have to be careful around. She's writing it all down. She's making the knowing mean something. And somewhere, 12 men are alive who might not be, who almost certainly wouldn't be, if a middle-aged woman from Oaxaca hadn't spent 12 years turning invisibility into the most precise instrument in the room. They called her just the cook. She was never just anything.